Her flesh did not burn clean. It curled like scorched parchment, blackening in jagged folds, clinging to bone, refusing to release her soul in silence. Smoke rose not like a curtain, but like a scream, thick, greasy, reeking of seared skin and sanctity, smothering the sky above Rouen with the smell of a martyr too young, too defiant, too female. Beneath the crackling pyre, the iron stake groaned in heat, and above it, tethered by rope and ridicule, the 19-year-old girl whose visions had once marched nations now stood alone in the theater of state-sponsored murder. There was no dignity in the flames. The crowd, a swollen and murmuring mass of cloth and breath, bore witness not to justice but to a ritual of obliteration. They did not look away. The officials, grim-faced bishops and soldiers with hands too clean, recited prayers that hung like poison in the air. Her eyes, blistering yet unclosed, met the void and did not flinch. There was no savior, no angel, no hand from heaven to extinguish the fire, only crackling wood, slumping limbs, and the slow ceremonial collapse of a saint in real time. And yet, centuries later, we dress her memory in white and gold. We speak of her triumph, her visions, her voices. But we forget the sounds, the smell, the stench of injustice smoldering beneath holy robes. We forget that before she became a symbol, she was an execution, and that execution, prolonged, personal, profane, left her body ash, but her agony echoing like a bell rung from hell. We share this story not to disturb, but because truth demands we remember, because the dead do not rest in silence when their deaths have been distorted, and because somewhere in the ritualized smoke of Joan's murder we may see a reflection of what power fears most, a voice too young, too divine, too unafraid. We tell these stories because we love you, because you matter, and because even the forgotten deserve to be remembered properly. She was not born into war, but into whispers. The village of Domremy, nestled in the marsh-wet meadows of Lorraine, was a land more forgotten than governed, where borders bled and God spoke louder than kings. In the year 1412, amid the rotting corpses of long campaigns and the festering wounds of a fractured France, a girl named Jeanne entered a world already trembling beneath the iron heel of foreign soldiers and domestic betrayal. She would one day be called Joan of Arc, but at birth she was no more than breath and blood. Another peasant child beneath a thatched roof, daughter to a farmer, baptized in the cold stone church that smelled of mildew, incense, and resignation. Her childhood was brief, not by years, but by the withering speed of innocence under siege. Domremy was torn, a sliver of loyalist blood in a territory drowning in English and Burgundian hostility. Soldiers passed like plague through the countryside, torching fields, silencing mouths, consuming bodies. She heard, too young, the sound of rape. She saw too early the way smoke curls from what used to be a home. The saints in the church above her bed stood eyeless, expressionless, while outside the world crumbled into hunger and shame. It was in this hollow, sacred ruin that Joan began to hear them, voices not of man, but of martyr. They came, she said, with light and clarity. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. Their visitations were not vague flickers, but vivid commands. To save France, to crown the rightful king, to drive out the English invaders. And perhaps, in the beginning, she wept from confusion. But in time, her voice aligned with theirs, not as a whisper, but a declaration. What emerged from thatched ceilings and muddy lanes was not merely a child with visions, but an oracle of war. Joan's sense of purpose ossified into something unflinching. She petitioned the nobility with terrifying resolve, cutting through layers of male power with little more than divine certainty and a command for audience. At 17, she stood before Charles VII, a king not yet crowned, not yet a king at all, and claimed she would lead his armies. There are moments in history that creak with the weight of disbelief, when a girl in peasant clothes dares to hold the hilt of history and turn it. This was such a moment. And in the trembling air between her words and the royal court's laughter, something shifted. Not because they believed in her, but because they feared not believing. Her military ascent was as unnatural as it was swift. With armor stitched to her ribs and a banner clenched like scripture, Joan rode at the front of battle. Not as a symbol, but as a strategist. Orléans, a city near collapse, was retaken beneath her gaze. Her presence, spectral and precise, turned sieges into sermons. She did not fight like a man. She led like an apparition. Her courage did not flow from flesh, but from vision. But with every victory, the noose tightened. Power never forgives what it cannot explain. Joan's triumph was a defilement to both crown and clergy. Her purity mocked their corruption. Her faith undermined their rituals. She was not theirs. She was God's. And in medieval France, that was the deepest heresy of all. The seeds of her destruction were already sown. Not by the English alone, but by those she sought to serve. In her rise was the echo of her ruin. For in a world built by men, a woman who commands the divine must be unmade. Joan of Arc had worn the armor, yes, but beneath the steel, something more fragile had always pulsed. A teenage girl's heart, stitched together with the brittle thread of visions. The sword could cut, the banner could rise, but her soul had always been trembling. For even saints must live within skin, and hers was blistering under the heat of betrayal. Captured at Compiègne by the Burgundians, sold like livestock to the English, her body passed from one enemy to another like a cursed relic. No longer a threat on the battlefield, she became something more dangerous, a symbol unmoored from chains. And symbols, when left to fester in prison cells, do not die. They ferment into nightmares for those who hold the keys. She was only 19, but her bones had carried the weight of kingdoms. Now, in Rouen, she carried only shackles and the damp rot of ecclesiastical justice. Her cell was no more than a pit carved into stone, no window, no silence. English guards watched her even as she slept, mocking, leering, afraid in the way men are afraid of what they do not understand. The church, terrified by the thunder of a girl who had dared to claim God's whisper, assigned a trial not for truth but for erasure. Their goal was not confession, but discredit. They did not need her to be wrong, they only needed her to be mad. And so began the interrogation. Not a questioning, but a ritual flaying of the mind. Day after day, over 70 times, they pressed her with snares cloaked in sanctity. Was it truly God who spoke, or a demon? Did she wear men's clothing by command, or by pride? Did she submit to the church, or to her own delusions? Each answer, no matter how clear, was twisted back upon her like a blade. Her words became nooses, her silences, proof of her guilt. Joan answered with a clarity that frightened them. She claimed no priestly training. She read no Latin. Yet her logic cut with the sharpness of prophecy. Still the weight bore down. The cell became a crucible. The walls crept inward. Sleep turned to tremors. The divine voices that once ignited her now arrived tangled in agony. Were they still angels, or the echoes of her own collapsing faith? They denied her a priest. They denied her mass. And in moments when her will wavered, when exhaustion swallowed even the strongest part of her, she confessed, not truly, not purely, but desperately. She signed a recantation. Though the words were not hers, she was promised freedom. Instead, she was returned to the same cell, to the same chains, to the same predators who had watched her undress, not with eyes, but with the lust to destroy what remained of her dignity. And so, she took up her armor again. Not on a battlefield, but in that cold hell of a room, beneath flickering torchlight with no witnesses but God and the rats. She donned men's clothing once more. Not from vanity, but protection. She knew what men did to women in darkness. She knew what surrender meant in this place. She knew her body had already been claimed for fire. To the church, this was relapse. Proof of heresy. A woman wearing trousers in the eyes of God. Unforgivable. They pronounced her relapse a mortal sin. It was no longer a matter of confusion. It was defiance. And defiance, in the body of a woman, was death. But in truth, Joan was already unraveling. Not in spirit, but in flesh. Her hair, once cropped in military form, now fell in greasy strands. Her eyes, once alight with divine fury, flickered like spent candles. The divine voices, once clear as church bells, had grown faint, muffled by suffering, haunted by fear. She questioned now not only the men who sentenced her, but the God who had once commanded her. Why had he sent her? Why had he abandoned her? Was the fire to be the final revelation? Sleep became hallucination. Hunger twisted into visions. Every mocking face in court became a demon in cassock. She could not tell if the whispers were from heaven or from madness. Perhaps they were one and the same. And yet, in this slow collapse of certainty, she found something deeper than courage. She found resignation, not the coward's surrender, but the martyr's assent. She understood now what the stake meant. She understood that truth was not always salvation, that sainthood in this world was crucifixion, and that to carry a divine voice in a body made of bone was to be devoured. Slowly, publicly, purposefully. There is a violence that begins not with a sword, but with belief. And in Rouen, that belief, that a girl could be chosen by heaven, was being bled from her inch by inch. They would not allow her to die in armor. They would strip her to linen, to shame, to embers. They would turn her into a cautionary tale before the smoke rose. In the last weeks before her sentence, Joan stopped speaking. Her silence became its own form of scripture. The interrogators, having exhausted their questions, resorted to shouting, but she simply looked at them, not with hatred, but with something worse. Pity. For she knew now what they did not, that her execution would not bury her. It would birth her. She no longer belonged to this earth. But the fire, yes, the fire, would ensure that the earth never forgot her. The morning broke not with sunlight, but with the echo of steps on stone, the metallic clatter of armor, the mutter of Latin prayers, the scrape of wooden wheels carrying the instruments of death. The city of Rouen did not wake so much as it waited. The square outside the old market was already swollen with bodies, breath thick in the air, nerves stitched to silence. There was no festival, no joy, and yet the people gathered, as they always do when the state performs its most ancient rite, public destruction. In the center of the square stood the scaffold, not modest, not crude, but built like an altar. 3 stories high, stacked with bundles of wood bound by wire, soaked in pitch. At its heart, the iron stake, rusted and tall, awaited its victim. The pyre was not assembled for speed. It was constructed for spectacle. Not a fire to kill, but a fire to instruct. This was not mercy. This was precision. Joan was led from her prison barefoot, shackled, wrapped in a coarse linen shift that clung to her limbs like a shroud. Her face, thin, colorless, unadorned, bore the weight of something beyond fear. She did not cry, she did not tremble, but her lips moved in prayer, soundless, frantic, constant. Behind her, monks chanted, soldiers cleared a path, and ahead of her, the stake loomed like a crucifix carved in iron. She had not been allowed confession. The church, in its cruelty, denied her the final rites. For what absolution can be granted to a woman who claimed the voice of God while wearing a man's coat? To them, she was already damned. But Joan prayed anyway. not to be saved, but to be remembered. As they bound her to the stake, the ropes bit into her flesh. 4 thick cords, twisted round her chest, her waist, her legs, her arms, thin from starvation, bruised from interrogation, were stretched behind the post. A pointed cap was placed upon her head. Heretic, scrawled in ink and mockery, as if the fire would not be enough. Below her, the wood crackled with anticipation. Torches lit from the nearby church were passed like relics to those who would ignite the final judgment. A crowd of thousands surrounded the scaffold, nobles and peasants, mothers and merchants, priests with scrolls, children on shoulders. Some watched with pity, others with horror, but many watched with silence. The kind of silence that settles not from reverence, but from complicity. There were no cries for mercy, only the murmurs of ritual. At the final moment, Joan looked upward, not to the heavens, but to the sky itself. Grey, veiled, indifferent. She did not see angels. She did not see light, only smoke already rising. Then the torch was touched to the base. The flames did not leap. They crawled, slow, greedy, deliberate. They licked the edges of the stacked wood, circling her feet like serpents. First came the heat, the unholy kiss of it, blistering the soles, warping the nails. Then the smoke, thick, acrid, choking. It rose into her eyes, into her lungs, curling into her throat like a fist. She coughed, she gasped, but still she prayed. Jesus! Her voice cracked, hoarse. Jesus! The fire climbed. It consumed her ankles, her calves, turning skin to cinders, muscle to jelly. She writhed, not wildly, but with the involuntary agony of flesh surrendering its shape. Her eyes rolled upward. Her chest heaved against the ropes. The linen shift ignited in shreds, revealing glimpses of blistered skin beneath. Still, she did not scream. Not yet. But when the flames reached her torso, they did not burn. They devoured. The lungs filled with fire, the ribs cracked open, and from her mouth came a sound not human, not divine, but something raw, eternal. Not a scream, but a release. Not terror, but transcendence. The crowd recoiled. Some wept, others turned away, but many watched. They watched as her hair disintegrated into smoke. They watched as her skin blackened and peeled like bark from a dying tree. They watched as her body slumped, held upright only by the ropes. Her fingers clawed, her mouth open, her eyes burned blind. Still the fire climbed. It took her face, her breast, her spine. The cap fell. The label heretic was lost in the ash. And when the fire reached her heart, whatever was left, it did not stop. It surged higher into her throat, into her skull, until there was nothing left but a silhouette of flame, a figure made entirely of agony. The executioner was ordered to lower the fire afterward, not to show mercy, but to verify death. He scattered the coals. The ropes burned through. Joan's corpse crumpled, not as a body, but as residue. The bishop approached, shaking with something like guilt. "Would that my soul were where hers is now," he whispered. Too late. The ritual was complete. But they were not finished. The English, fearing she would be revered as a martyr, ordered her ashes gathered and thrown into the Seine. Her heart, unburned, still pulsing with posthumous defiance, was seized and discarded. No relics, no grave, no shrine, only water, only forgetting. They hoped to drown her in anonymity, to erase her from relic, from rumor, from resurrection. But fire cannot erase what fire has made holy. They had not killed a girl, they had kindled a myth. And the smell of that morning, burning linen, charring flesh, holy oil vaporized by heat, would linger far longer than the prayers of the men who lit the match. The square, once swollen with anticipation and grim curiosity, began to disperse like a shaken curtain of ash carried by the winds. The lingering smoke curled, lazy and malevolent, through the narrow streets of Rouen, seeping into every crevice, every shuttered window, embedding itself into the bones of the city. Beneath the layered robes of nobles and the roughened tunics of peasants, a profound silence spread, not of peace, but of erasure. Joan's body, reduced to ash, scattered upon the Seine's cold current, became a bitter token of absence. The city pretended she had never been more than a flicker, a passing shadow swallowed by flame. Yet beneath that forced forgetting, a darker narrative began to take shape. The Church's official verdict, pronounced with solemnity and sanctimony, branded her a heretic, a witch, a blasphemer who had deceived kings and defiled sacred rites. The judges and clergy, cloaked in the garments of righteousness, saw themselves as arbiters of divine justice, yet their voices trembled with a fear unspoken. The fear that in killing her, they had ignited something far beyond their control. Across France, the common folk whispered. Her name passed through lips tight with grief and rage, carried by pilgrims who had once witnessed her fiery banner fluttering above besieged walls. The peasants, those who had seen in her a glimmer of hope amid the squalor and bloodshed, mourned not only her death, but the ruthless spectacle of her annihilation. To them, the Church's flames had burned not only flesh, but the fragile light of deliverance. Meanwhile, in the courts of kings and dukes, political ripples expanded like cracks in ice. Charles VII, the uncrowned monarch whom Joan had championed, found himself shackled by the same forces that condemned her. Though he owed his coronation to her courage, he remained silent, a sovereign bound by the precarious dance of power, fearful that to defend her was to invite the wrath of both the English and his own clergy. The throne he sat upon was forged from compromise, its foundations stained with betrayal. For years, her trial and execution remained a festering wound in the body politic of France, a whispered ghost haunting halls of power and hearths alike. Secret inquiries, appeals, and petitions emerged from those who dared to question the Church's verdict, accusing her judges of corruption and miscarriage of justice. The political machinations twisted, coiling around her memory like a serpent, binding truth with falsehood until it became nearly impossible to separate the martyr from the myth, the truth from the spectacle. Publicly, the Church attempted to bury the scandal beneath layers of ritual condemnation, but privately, the trial's grotesque details leaked into the corridors of power. The psychological torment inflicted upon a girl barely out of childhood, the calculated humiliation, the denial of priestly comfort. These were sins unspoken in official annals, yet known to many. They whispered in candle-lit chambers, in hushed corridors, where the air was thick with incense and fear. In villages far from the capital, peasants clung to stories of Joan's visions, her fiery spirit, and her relentless faith. She became a symbol of resistance, a beacon for the oppressed who saw in her an echo of their own suffering and dreams. Songs were sung in taverns, not of kings and princes, but of the Maid of Orleans, whose flame had not been extinguished by mortal fire. The irony of her demise, wrapped in the ceremonial robes of piety, was a cruel testament to the limits of institutional power. The Church, in its quest to enforce orthodoxy, had unleashed a paradox. The death of Joan of Arc did not silence her voice, it amplified it beyond the reach of her executioners. Her burning was not an end, but an invitation to remember, to question, to resist. In the years following her death, her story became a battleground of competing truths, one told by those who sought to erase her as a heretic, and another whispered by those who revered her as a saint. The crowd that had once watched her burn now fragmented into factions, those who feared her legacy, those who mourned her loss, and those who awaited the day when the flames that consumed her would ignite a revolution. The city of Rouen itself bore the scars of that day long after the ashes had scattered. The stones in the square, blackened by fire, seemed to pulse with silent memory. The smell of burnt linen and scorched flesh lingered in the air like a ghost's breath, haunting the marketplaces and churches alike. It was as if the city itself refused to forget the agony performed upon its stage. Even the river Seine, cold and indifferent, became a bearer of remembrance, carrying the remnants of her body downstream, mingling with water, mud, and time. Her ashes slipped beneath its surface, but her story floated above it, rising like smoke to touch the heavens. And so, Joan's execution became not merely a historical act of brutality, but a spectral performance etched into the consciousness of a nation. A wound too raw for healing, a question too profound for answers. The immediate aftermath was not closure, but the beginning of a slow, aching reckoning. In the centuries that followed, Joan's death refused to stay buried. It festered, not like a memory, but like a splinter in the eye of history. What was meant to be an execution became a birth. What was intended as obliteration became ritual sanctification. The flames had not consumed her. They had canonized her in the ash. Her name, once spat in trials and scribbled in condemnation, began to resurface in strange places. In the mouths of peasants, in the ink of dissenting clerics, in the dreams of kings who no longer felt secure. She moved like incense through the corridors of time, fragrant, suffocating, impossible to ignore. The girl once tethered to a stake became a spectre trailing behind banners, whispering through cathedral walls. Not a martyr merely, but a mirror, reflecting both divinity and guilt upon the faces of those who had watched her burn. In 1456, 25 years after the fire had swallowed her bones, the Church opened her case once again, not from conscience, but from necessity. Charles VII, secure on his throne and newly conscious of history's judgment, authorized an inquest. The reversal was political, not spiritual. But even in calculation, there bloomed a kind of redemption. Witnesses came forward. The transcript of her trial, thick with contradiction and cruelty, was laid bare. What emerged was not the portrait of a heretic, but the autopsy of a saint. She was posthumously declared innocent. The original trial, it was ruled, had been tainted by fraud, injustice, and deceit. The bishops who had condemned her were named, the record corrected, the verdict reversed, but the reversal came not with her breath, only with her memory. Her bones had long since washed away. The fire had taken her body, but the truth came too late to soothe her suffering. And yet, memory is its own kind of resurrection. Over time, Joan of Arc became something more than flesh, more than even faith. She became a symbol sculpted by each generation's longing. To some, she was the patroness of France, her sword etched into the nation's spine. To others, she was the embodiment of divine femininity, a virgin warrior armored by God. For revolutionaries, she was the voice of the people. For monarchists, a sacred defender of the crown. For poets, a vision. For skeptics, a paradox. She was all of these, and none of them. Her image was fragmented, refracted through centuries of appropriation. Paintings cast her as delicate and divine. Statues carved her in marble resolve. Plays and books rendered her tragic and radiant. She was burned at 19, but remade 1,000 times. Always more glorious than human, always more distant than real. And still, the fire lingered. It lingered in the uneasy silence that falls when power faces purity. It lingered in the memory of how easily a girl could be broken. Not for what she did, but for what she dared to believe. It lingered in the sulfuric stench of justice masked in ritual, and the terrible ease with which institutions can turn sanctity into spectacle. Her symbolism expanded like smoke through stained glass. The sword she once bore, the real one, dull and heavy, became mythic in weight. The banner she carried, a white cloth embroidered with God's name, became the banner of righteousness itself. Her voices, once suspected, now revered, were recast not as hallucinations, but as sacred instruction. The fire that killed her was repurposed into a halo. Her executioners disappeared from memory. Only her ash remained. In 1920, 500 years after her death, the church that once denied her sacraments declared her a saint. The same institution that mocked her with chants and silence now lit candles beneath her effigy. They renamed her the Maid of Orleans. Saint Joan, she became divine in marble, far removed from the girl with blistered feet and bloodied wrists. Her canonization was less an act of justice than of fear. The fear that heaven might not forgive what the church had done in its name. But sainthood, too, is a kind of prison. It polishes what was once raw. It silences the scream beneath the incense. And so the true tragedy of Joan of Arc is not that she died, but that her death has been wrapped in too many veils. Because the girl was real. She bled when struck. She wept when shamed. She broke when betrayed. Her heart did not burn in golden flame. It blistered, burst, blackened in smoke. She did not ascend in a vision. She collapsed in agony before a crowd that said nothing, and in that silence lies the deepest truth. That history does not remember as it should. That memory can be as cruel as fire. That sometimes sainthood is a second execution, the kind that strips away the unbearable humanity of the one we claim to honor. Joan's legacy, then, is not purity. It is confrontation, a sword held not against the enemy, but against the soul of power itself. She remains still the question no regime can fully answer. What happens when a peasant girl believes God more than priests? What happens when a voice speaks from within the flames? What happens when the ashes refuse to settle? It was May 30th, 1431. Rouen was quiet that morning. Not because it was solemn, but because the city held its breath, as if afraid to interfere with what was about to happen. Joan was led out of her cell by English soldiers. She was pale, gaunt, and weakened by months of imprisonment, interrogations, and psychological torture. But even in that fragility, something in her posture remained unbroken. The square had been prepared the day before, a massive wooden stake erected in the middle, dry timber and straw piled high beneath it. The execution was not a hurried affair. It was calculated, public, political, and deeply personal. As she was brought into the marketplace, bound in chains, the crowd had already gathered, merchants, peasants, clergy, noblemen. Some came to witness justice, others to witness a spectacle. Many were silent, others murmured prayers or curses. But all eyes locked onto the teenage girl, dressed in a simple white robe, walking toward her own death. The judges were there. So were the English commanders. Bishop Pierre Cochon, the orchestrator of her trial, sat on a platform nearby. He was expressionless, perhaps triumphant, perhaps conflicted. The records do not say. What we do know is that he watched her burn. Before they tied her to the stake, Joan asked for a cross. Not a crown, not mercy, just a cross. A kind English soldier, reportedly moved by her calm, fashioned a crude cross from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She kissed it, held it tightly to her chest. Another priest fetched the cathedral cross and held it before her as she was tied to the stake. Her eyes never left it. They bound her with iron chains, around her waist, her legs, her chest. She was not just being executed, she was being erased. The fire was lit beneath her feet. At first, it was smoke, thick, choking, crawling up her body before the flames touched her. Her voice rang out, high and human. She cried for Jesus. She called to the saints. She pleaded for forgiveness, not for herself, but for those killing her. Witnesses later wrote that her voice echoed like a church bell, pure and unrelenting. She did not scream like a criminal. She did not curse her executioners. She died like someone who believed every word she had ever spoken, every vision, every command, every prophecy. As the flames rose, the white of her robe turned gray, then black. Her body convulsed. Her skin blistered and split. But still she cried, "Jesus," until her lungs could no longer bear breath, and even then her lips moved. The fire consumed her slowly, deliberately. The wood had been arranged to prolong the agony. This was not mercy. This was instruction, a warning to others. Do not defy us. When it was over, there was no body to bury. Her remains were burned twice. First to kill her, and then again to ensure no relic could be taken. Even her ashes were scattered in the Seine River, erased, wiped from the earth. But the fire failed. Not to kill her. It did that efficiently. But to silence her, to erase her voice, her impact, her name, it failed spectacularly. Because what burned that day in Rouen was not just a girl. It was the mask of power stripped off by the courage of someone who had no right. In their eyes. To speak, to lead, to believe. And yet she did. And now, centuries later, we do not remember the men who lit the fire. We do not name the guards or honor the judges. But we remember Joan, the girl who said no to kings, who answered only to God, who marched into war with no armor but her belief, who died alone, abandoned and betrayed, but did not break. The morning of May 30th, 1431 was damp with mist, as if even the skies mourned what was about to unfold. Joan of Arc, only 19 years old, was led from her prison cell at the Château Bouvreuse. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes tired but defiant. After months of isolation, mock trials, and spiritual torment, she now faced the final cruelty, public death by fire. She had recanted days earlier, signing a confession to save her life, or so she thought. But when the church learned she had resumed dressing in men's clothing, they declared her a relapsed heretic, a fate that demanded execution without mercy. The truth was simpler and more sinister. Her captors had laid out only male clothing in her cell, giving her no alternative. It was a trap, and it had sprung. She was taken through the narrow streets of Rouen, past crowds who had gathered out of curiosity, fear, or fanaticism. The air was thick with the sounds of horses, clanking armor, and murmurs that carried the weight of centuries. Some wept, others hurled insults. Most simply stared, caught between witnessing history and watching horror. At the old market square, a wooden platform had been erected. In the center stood a tall stake surrounded by bundles of dry wood and kindling stacked waist high. She was tied tightly to the stake, her arms bound, her feet barely touching the platform below. A Dominican friar, Isambard de la Pierre, wept as he tried to comfort her, while another read out her sentence. No family, no army, no angels came for her this time. Before the fire was lit, Joan asked for a crucifix. Someone from the crowd handed her a rough wooden cross, which she kissed and clutched close to her chest. A priest held another cross before her eyes as she was tied tighter, her breathing shallow now, the flames waiting. Then the torch was lowered. The fire started slowly, crackling at first, then snapping into a roar as it climbed the pyre. The heat was unimaginable, and yet Joan did not scream as quickly as the crowd expected. Her voice rang out instead, over the fire, over the shouting, over the prayers. "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," she cried again and again, until the smoke stole her breath and the flames claimed her body. Eyewitnesses later said it was one of the most horrifying executions ever seen. Her agony lasted longer than anyone could bear. Her flesh blistered and split. The smell of burning human remains filled the air. Some in the crowd fainted. Others turned away. The bishop who had condemned her wept into his robe, saying, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." And even when her body had been reduced to char and bone, the English feared she would be turned into a relic. They ordered her remains burned twice more, reducing everything to ash. Then they took the ashes and dumped them into the river Seine, hoping to erase her completely from memory. But you cannot drown a legacy. Joan's execution was intended as a message that no woman should dare defy church or crown, that no voice from the margins should be heard without permission. And yet her final act, facing the fire, not with despair, but with devotion, transformed her from condemned heretic to enduring symbol. In killing her, they made her immortal. History remembers many deaths. But few echo like Joan's. Her screams became scripture, her silence prophecy, her ashes a foundation. And in the smoke that rose over Rouen, the world saw not just a girl burned at the stake, but the birth of something eternal. The flames that consumed Joan of Arc on May 30th, 1431, did not extinguish her legacy. They ignited it. In the days following her execution, an uneasy silence hung over Rouen. The city that had once buzzed with rumors and jeers now whispered with regret. Those who had cheered at her trial could not unsee the girl in white, burning alive as she cried the name of Jesus. Soldiers looked away, priests trembled. The Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cochon, the man who had led her condemnation, fled Rouen within days, his name forever stained. Even among the English, unease spread like smoke. Had they truly killed a heretic or a holy woman? But it would take years for the world to begin reckoning with what had truly happened. After Joan's death, the war between France and England raged on. Yet something had shifted. The fire in Rouen seemed to spark new hope across France. Stories of Joan's courage spread like wildfire, passed from village to village, sung by soldiers at campfires, whispered by peasants who had seen her ride. Charles VII, the very king Joan had helped crown, said nothing publicly about her death at first. Some called him a coward for not intervening. Others said he feared that defending her would brand him a heretic too. But Joan had already done her part. She had turned a frightened prince into a king. And though the English still held much of northern France, they could not hold the spirit she had unleashed. By 1453, more than 20 years after her execution, the 100 Years' War came to an end. France stood victorious. The English had lost nearly all their French territories, and Joan, long dead, was being remembered not as a traitor, but as a heroine. Then came the reckoning. In 1455, at the request of Joan's family and under the authority of Pope Calixtus III, the Church launched an official investigation into her trial. Known as the Nullification Trial, it lasted more than a year. Over 100 witnesses were called. Soldiers, villagers, priests, even former enemies. They testified about her piety, her visions, her bravery, her compassion. They described the unfairness of her original trial, how the judges were handpicked by the English, how she was denied legal counsel, how she was tricked into condemning herself. In July 1456, the verdict was announced. Joan of Arc had been wrongfully executed. Her original trial was declared invalid, her name cleared. The Church called her a martyr. It was a stunning reversal. The same institution that had called her a witch and heretic now recognized her innocence. But for many, the truth had been clear all along. In the centuries that followed, Joan became more than just a figure of French history. She became a symbol for the world. A woman who stood alone against powerful forces, who followed her conscience even when it led to death. Artists painted her in armor. Writers immortalized her story. Politicians invoked her name in times of crisis. And finally, in 1920, Nearly 500 years after her death, Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. The very altar that once judged her now honored her. She became Saint Joan, patron of France, of soldiers, of the oppressed. But perhaps her most powerful legacy lives not in churches or history books, but in the quiet courage she inspires in every young person who stands up for justice, even when alone. In every woman told she cannot lead, yet does so anyway. In every believer who follows a vision, even when others laugh. Joan rides again. She was just a girl, illiterate, poor, and yet she saw what others could not. She heard a call that defied reason, and she obeyed it, not for glory, not for power, but for something deeper. Faith. In burning her body, they thought they were silencing her forever, but her voice still echoes, centuries later, fierce, fragile, and unforgettable. The trial of Joan of Arc was never meant to be fair. It was theatre, grim, clerical, political theatre. Not a search for truth, but a desperate attempt to rewrite it. Rouen courtroom, with its high stone walls and echoing chambers, wasn't a place of judgment. It was a place of erasure. Joan, barely 19, stood before a tribunal of more than 60 judges, nearly all clergy loyal to the English crown. These weren't neutral holy men. These were hand-picked agents of a political vendetta, disguised in robes of sanctity. Their mission was simple: crush Joan's credibility, unravel the legend, and by doing so, dismantle the myth of French divine support that she embodied. They didn't question her for truth. They questioned her to trap her. Day after day, they hurled theological riddles, complex doctrinal traps, and obscure canon law at a teenager who had never studied Latin, had never sat in a classroom, and had never been trained in formal theology. But what they did not expect, what unnerved even her prosecutors, was her astonishing composure. She spoke plainly, confidently, even wittily. She outmaneuvered them with faith rather than philosophy. When they asked her if she was in God's grace, a loaded question meant to damn her either way, Joan replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may He keep me." It stunned the court. The question was a theological bear trap, but she walked through it untouched. Her responses were not rehearsed. They were instinctual, fierce, unshakable. At times, it seemed Joan was not the one on trial. The judges were. For how do you break someone who doesn't fear death? How do you shame someone who sees her suffering as a sacred test? And yet, the walls were closing in. The judges used every trick: psychological exhaustion, prolonged isolation, threats of torture. She was deprived of counsel. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, though she spoke only French. She had no legal defense, no advocate, and was denied the right to appeal to the Pope. The goal was to make her contradict herself, to force her into a moment of theological error and label it heresy. The stake was already built in their minds. All they needed was a signature beneath the sentence. Joan, however, refused to be convenient. She stood by her voices. She maintained they were divine. She refused to betray her visions to win her freedom. When asked whether she believed her voices were from God, she replied without hesitation, "Yes, and I trust them more than I trust you." The judges twisted her answers, edited her words, and compiled a transcript riddled with bias. Even so, Joan's spiritual clarity bled through. She believed herself an instrument of heaven, not because she was arrogant, but because she truly felt chosen. And if that made her dangerous, it was because she had touched something her enemies could not: the hearts of ordinary people. The trial lasted months, a grotesque spectacle of power disguised as piety. Eventually, under threat of being burned alive, Joan, terrified and alone, signed an abjuration, a confession crafted by her judges that admitted to heresy. It was a moment of psychological collapse. She believed she might be imprisoned for life. But days later, When she realized the terms were false and that her visions were being publicly denied in her name, she withdrew her confession. She reclaimed her truth, and by doing so, she sealed her fate. Joan of Arc had been condemned long before the first question was asked. The trial was never about guilt. It was about symbolism. To kill her was to erase the idea that France could win with God's favor. To burn her was to send smoke up to heaven carrying a message. Your chosen one is ash. But what they didn't realize was that martyrs don't vanish in smoke. They haunt. They linger. They ignite revolutions long after the flames go out. And Joan? She would become not a heretic, but a saint. The ashes of Joan of Arc did not scatter into silence. After her death in 1431, the Church, the English crown, and the world tried to reduce her legacy to mere particles of bone and smoke. But the execution had failed in one crucial task: erasure. They had burned the girl, but they had kindled something far greater, something eternal. The wood of the pyre turned to coal, her bones to dust, and yet people whispered her name in prayers, in taverns, in the barracks of France, where soldiers clung to scraps of hope. The very act meant to obliterate her had become an act of creation, a martyrdom that slowly redefined her identity from heretic to holy. The men who had condemned her, Bishop Pierre Cauchon and his English sponsors, believed they had sealed her fate forever. But 2 decades later, the tide turned. In 1456, King Charles VII, the very man Joan had lifted to the throne, ordered a posthumous retrial. The goal? Redemption. What followed was not just a trial, but an exorcism of guilt. Witnesses returned, this time no longer in fear. Villagers, soldiers, and clergy who had known Joan came forward. They spoke not of madness, but of courage. Not of lies, but of faith. Her trial, once a dark page in the Church's record, was now a beacon of shame for those who had orchestrated it. The verdict was overturned. Joan of Arc was declared innocent. Her execution, officially, was a mistake, a judicial murder. But history does not simply stop at innocence. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, Joan was canonized by the Roman Catholic Church. Saint Joan, the peasant girl who had heard voices, who had led armies, who had defied men, monarchs, and misogyny. She was not just remembered, she was resurrected. Statues were erected in her image. Cathedrals echoed her name. Artists painted her with halos. Writers penned poetry about her fire, not the one that killed her, but the one she lit in the hearts of generations. Even skeptics of faith could not ignore the power of her story. A tale of conviction, youth, betrayal, and an undying flame. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Joan is not sainthood. It is rebellion. Joan's life teaches us that the systems we think are sacred, the church, the courts, the kings, are often flawed. That truth is not always found in robes or crowns, but in the trembling voice of a teenage girl who says, "I believe." Her story is not meant to comfort us. It is meant to shake us, to remind us that injustice, even when sanctioned by law or religion, is still injustice, that bravery does not come dressed in armor, but often in chains, and that sometimes it is the people history tries hardest to silence who return with the loudest echo. She was 19 when they murdered her. She is eternal now, and that is how you turn ash into light. History has no shortage of kings, popes, and generals, men who built empires with swords and lies. But Joan of Arc carved her legacy with nothing more than faith, courage, and a voice she refused to silence. She was a peasant, a teenager, illiterate, unarmed, and yet she changed the course of a war, crowned a king, and frightened the most powerful empire of her time, not with violence, but with conviction. Her life was short, but it was not small. She stood in courtrooms filled with learned men and refused to betray her truth. She marched alongside soldiers who had known only defeat and gave them victory. She walked into the flames of her execution with more dignity than those who lit the fire. Centuries later, her name still stirs hearts. Not because she was perfect, but because she was human and chose to rise anyway. She reminds us that belief is not weakness, that defiance can be sacred. That when you carry your truth like a sword, the world has no choice but to remember you, not as a victim, but as a legend. Joan of Arc was burned, but her fire still burns.